Hello, my name is Jamie Garcia, and I'm going to talk about the three questions. So, my first question I'm going to respond to is the research process. And in the research process, before entering this class, what I would usually do was I would first search on Google, Bing, or Wikipedia, and I would type in my research question. And if and what I would do is that when I would receive articles or anything, I would just click the first two or three links and use those articles or journals and use them for my research question. Even if they weren't that great or they didn't fully support my argument, I would still use them. Mostly in the research process, I was quite lazy. For me, I always thought it was just a simple process, which meant by picking any article and choosing which one has better smart words and using it just to get an A or whatever, or that way I wouldn't spend so much time on it. But while in this class, what I did learn was interesting things, and one of them was the craft sheet here, as you can see. And in here, one thing that it really did was it opened my eyes to see that not every article or journal you find is always going to be the right one, or it's going to be a non legal one, or it's going to be a good one. It's not going to be considered something that's fake. And so here, as you can see, is this what this does is that it actually is supposed to consider whether or not your article that you've chosen is actually good, whether if it's strong or if it's consistent. So here, of course, right here, one of the main things that I do enjoy about this is the currency, knowing knowing what year it is from and whether it's valuable. So, for instance, of course, like we all know, you don't want to get an article that was from the 50s or the 60s because, of course, we're not living in that time. And that time that from that research is old and doesn't come up to date. So here, of course, one of my articles that I found was from 2011. And for me, my research process, I wanted to kind of consider like 10 years or so, at least 10 years, maybe 5. And of course, right here is with the year and whether or not it has been revised or updated, which, kind of should be considering that it's in a published article. And here it tells you, and you get to write things down like whether does it require older sources or is it functional, meaning does it pull you to another source that's valuable and that is considerable rather than it being fake or being a spam or whatever. So this is also one thing that I also know about or learned about was that if it's good, if these authors actually are credible, they're not just people who are hired by ABC or NBC to just write an article and put simple words, but rather than them being specialists and having a degree in this topic or research. And then one of the things I did learn was to kind of put notes into it. That way, when you do go back into it, the article, you do understand what it's about, what's the claim, the purpose, what the writers are trying to tell you. And then another part of my research process is this. It's a critique and research. So after finding at least maybe 4 or 6 secondary sources, you get to write down what they talk about and the importance of their research, whether the differences or the similarities. And one thing that I learned about this was that it really did make my research process simpler. So that way I could actually pull these out and say, okay, this one talks about the major claims, or this one has their evidence this way. And also one thing I love about this is that it actually allows me to pull aside the differences and see, okay, which ones have a problem and which of them don't. And of course, some I did find a problem because they weren't necessarily giving me full information on my research. They did give me the background of it, but not truly the answer that I was seeking. And so this was helpful in the critique and research paper. And also, basically, it's talking about the gaps. Of course, gaps are known, like I said, is whether the problems that I find in these secondary sources and the problem that I need to figure out from finding primary sources. And then here's also another one that I chose. It's a design and test worksheet. This one was really helpful too because it actually lets me know like what's gonna be considered for my secondary sources, what I'm trying to find from my research question, and like what information I want And so I really enjoyed this, and I actually liked this because it made things a little simpler, and also made me have a simpler criteria when I go and research these sources and finding what actually supports my argument or not, maybe. And also, in this design test worksheet, usually it's for like a data analysis. So of course, my research question doesn't really pertain to interviewing people or observing classrooms or any sort of people. What I did do was just analyze documents or videos that pertains to my research question, and this really helped me out because it really set aside what I really wanted. Like for example, like my criteria right here was I wanted to specifically look at children with speech disorders and environments in their in regular classrooms, and whether or not they actually these sources actually are compatible to my question. And then here also is another thing for the research process is the analyze worksheet. So it's kind of like the documents I've gotten, and like how does it fit into my criteria and whether or not it actually supports my claim or my not claim but my arguments. So that was really helpful, and I really enjoyed this also because it really, of course, the same thing, it helps with the comparison similarities in these documents and finding out which ones are very important and actually the ones that I want to choose to support my argument and which are those that do not, so that way I could use it as a fact and kind of disagree with it on my opinions. And so of course here also, and here is also like the answers to my research question, and of course again discussing about whether it helps or disagrees with my argument. And yes, and then what also in this research process, what I've learned a lot from it is, of course, using all these papers here, as you can see, and having them make my research process easier, and letting people know that, you know, this is going in depth into the research process, because the research process does take a long time. You really can't find all these things in a week. I mean, you can, but really it's not going to be meaningful, the whole process. So I really find this really helpful and actually enjoyed it because it really did open my eyes to know that researching all these secondary sources or primary sources or documents is actually important, and you shouldn't just leave it alone and just choose whichever sounds smarter or better, because along the way, if you do that, you're not going to know what you're talking about. You're gonna find that little hole that you fall into and you think, oh my gosh, I couldn't find it, or like I don't know exactly what it's talking about, but hey, it's there, and it shouldn't be that way. So one thing that also that this thing will help me in life. So if I ever have trouble in the research process, first thing I could always keep is this crap worksheet. For example, you know, whether or not these articles are telling the truth or are actually, like, you know, certified to do this. And then the critique worksheet also to pull and see and dissect these sources and to see if they actually truly do talk about what they're claiming. So these design worksheets are actually helpful, and actually will keep these to help me with my other researches later on in my other classes and the future, because this will make things easier and better. And well, yeah, I mean, I'm going to use these for sure. And also just the fact that it does make things better and simpler. And even though it does take time, and of course there's a lot of information to put in, but once you put all this information at the end, when you gather on your information and sources and write about your research question, it will make things easier and better. And of course, you know, your essay will finally fall into place and the reader will understand what you're trying to discuss or talk about. So this is the research one, the research process. Okay, so on to my next question, and I chose that number 3, which is integrating secondary resources and writing with authority. So I think what most people know is that secondary sources, of course, the meaning is in the name, or the whole definitions in the name. Secondary sources, of course, are meant to just support argument, and they're just supposed to be on the sideline, whether or not like you need help from them or you need to make your reader understand what you're trying to imply. And so before knowing how to integrate my secondary sources or discuss about them, what I would first do was I would just include them. As you can see here, I would do the same thing. I would include the quotes, the authors, what they were talking about, and I would just leave it at that. I would just say, oh, what they're trying to say is yada yada, like, kids with speech disorders, they do have them from a young age and not just as they get older. And that's where I would just stop. I would just use them just for those purposes and not really explain how I feel about them or how they support or support my argument. And that was something I would just do because it just seemed like the easiest thing, and also because it never really seemed like an idea just keep on going on and on with them. For me, it was always just, okay, just put them as in order and discuss about it, and that's it, and move on. And in the end, you discuss or whatever. So that was what I would do. But then in this class, during this time, it really changed my whole perception on secondary sources. They are important, but they're not as important as your own argument and what you're trying to claim. So here, as you can see, where I have my secondary sources and I put them in here, or one of them, what I would do was that, okay, so what I learned was not only you're trying to include them in and trying to talk about, of course, what you're talking about, but you want to end it on a note on your own opinion. You want the reader to know that this is your own argument, that yes, these secondary sources are helpful and they do answer some of your questions, but you have to make the reader understand that this is your own question, this is your own answer. So, of course, from right here, this one talks about how children with literacy disorders can also have more than one disorder, and that's where I ended on that note. But what I also included was my own opinion, which I put, I can see this being true from including my experiences or observe or anything that I've found or seen. I include that in my secondary sources. So I'm writing with authority, claiming that yes, this is true, or I do believe what they're trying to say because it does follow up on my research question. And from what I'm claiming or what I'm talking about, it does support it. So that's something that I'm introducing to my secondary sources, is not just having it support me and just do that itself, but also for me to actually make that reader know that I do believe this is true, that this is what is good on my argument. So as you can see on my other secondary sources, I did the same. Now, of course, what you can do also with writing with integrity and authority on your secondary sources is that some of them, you don't have to agree with them. And of course, I think everyone knows is that with secondary sources, you try to choose the ones that do sound right and actually help make your argument sound better. And of course, they're supposed to agree with you. But one thing that I did learn is that they don't always have to agree with you, and it's good to actually have sources that don't. That way, it gives your reader an understanding of what other claims there are and how you yourself, the writer, can actually tell the reader, like, this is not true or this can't be because based on my experiences, yada yada yada, and it actually makes your argument, your claim stronger. So that is something. However, in mine, most of my resources, I actually do agree with them because they do talk about my research questions, speech disorders, and the impacts on it on reading and writing. So that is something that I've learned from these secondary sources and writing with authority, is that it's not that you're supposed to be behind these secondary sources, that they're supposed to be behind you, helping you, not the other way around. And one thing also is helping me from this is even though I've learned this, I actually am going to apply this in the future because it actually will not only does it sound better, but it actually makes my point stronger. And I don't want to say it's a risk-taking thing, but it kind of does seem like that. When you do include sources that you don't agree with, it really does open the reader's eyes actually and see how other sources may claim this, but they don't follow exactly that because like I said, depending on your experiences or other things that you've heard or know aren't exactly true from the secondary sources claims. So this is something I've learned. And of course, I'll keep it with me forever because it actually is interesting. And it really does strike an importance in these essay questions and the essay, of course. And yeah, so So my last question that I want to answer is number 7, which is the peer feedback process. So, however, we didn't learn a lot about peer feedback process throughout the whole class. I mean, it only happened certain parts, but it did happen, of course, a little bit. But before we get to that, before the peer feedback process, what I would do basically was, of course, our professors would encourage us to actually get peer feedback and ask questions and to not be afraid. And for me, sometimes I would be afraid. Usually I would just ask questions that were simple, whether, oh, is my title right? Or is this wording right? Or do you think I should change this and not that? Or I would always I would never really ask the most difficult questions that I needed help with. So, and one thing was that even though, that was just receiving feedback, but to give feedback, sometimes I wasn't always, I wouldn't really necessarily give strong feedback. I didn't want to hurt their feelings, or I didn't want to sound too aggressive. So sometimes I would just tread lightly and type in a few words and say, oh, it was good, it was great, but maybe change this or that. And it didn't really seem too critical. And of course, that's not what I wanted to be too critical, but I was never careful. I was always trying to be careful on how to give good feedback. And that necessarily isn't always the best thing because, okay, so now we're going to go back to what I learned. So here we have is my research question and what I wanted to talk about. And here's my intro. And so, of course, Bonnie, or, Bonnie Garcia, she actually told us to ask questions we need help on, the things that we actually need help, meaning which of these are actually that we need to ask to people that we can get better feedback, and that you won't just stick to asking the simplest questions of like, oh, is my grammar right, is my spelling right, or should I choose this word instead of this. You really got to like take away all those questions and just ask the ones where, is my topic question relating to my sources or to my conclusion, or my conclusion getting to the point? Is it actually telling people what to do, or is it just stating the obvious, or just stating whatever that doesn't really pertain to my whole question? And so, as you can see here, one thing that I really was encouraged to do was, these questions, you have to be very specific. So you can't say, was my topic good or great? Because of course the person's going to think, okay, well, how am I going to think your topic is good as great if I don't know what you're talking about, or if it doesn't go well with what you're discussing, your claims, your arguments. So here, one thing that I had asked was this topic, or not the topic, sorry, my introduction, including in whether or not it was good or great, but I asked whether it really does talk about, what's pertained in my research, or my essay actually. And what I got was good feedback, which was, to kind of switch it to something that was pertaining to my essay, and something that actually made the reader engage. So that was pretty nice and cool. And then one thing also was the cool thing that I actually enjoyed about this whole peer feedback process was the fact that you really have to be specific, and you have to really ask them the things you need help with. And so that was pretty interesting, and I don't know, I just enjoyed that. And also because it really took like a couple blocks off my shoulder, rather than kind of not wanting to interfere with other people, or ask too many questions. I wanted to, and that really helped a lot. And then one thing also, okay, so I really don't have someone's essay. I mean, I could, but I don't know. But about the peer feedback process. So about the giving feedback to people, one thing was of course, with the questions on being specific on who their audience is, or whether or not they're actually explaining things. Giving peer feedback, it really was cool because not only was I helping people, but I could actually, give them an insight of how the reader could take on their essay, or their not choice of words, but choice of how they're explaining it. And so that was pretty interesting and cool. And one thing that I enjoyed was reading people's papers and actually typing in my ideas, other things that they have not tried, or things that that could actually change their essay in a cool way or somewhat like that. So that was pretty cool, and that's something that I actually enjoy doing. And the whole peer feedback process was, it was pretty quick, but it really gave me understanding on how to actually ask for feedback and things like that. So yeah, so one thing, of course, again, that I can apply this to my future is to not be afraid to ask for any feedback, or to not be afraid to give, you know, too critical feedback, saying, hey, we need to change this, and this sounds better than before, or you're swerving off to a different direction. So that's something that I've learned from this, and also to kind of communicate with other people and to know where they're falling in, and also identify similar problems that we may have, and that we could actually help each other, and actually make notice of my own problem, so that way I can ask better feedback. So those are the three things that I've learned in this class, and it's a lot of information, of course, and a lot of process to do, but it was fun and it was interesting, and it really did give me an insight on how to do better do better research actually, and knowing secondary and primary sources and all these things, and feedback, of course. So these three things really had a good effect on me, and it actually has helped me to know later on in life that I could use these easily, and to understand how this whole thing goes, and how this all can help make a better impact on my essay, of course. And so those are my final three, and thank you for listening.